think whenever we're talking about these sorts of things, it's really interesting because I have this deep-seated belief, which I know is flawed, that I am a unique snowflake and I operate unlike anyone. So I don't want to leave this interview without you telling us a little bit about the golden thread. You know, what is that, and how can companies apply that to their assessment eyes, I believe, even the way that they sort of reward and promote people internally.
So this is the sort of interesting thing that I discovered, particularly in the last few years, about how we do recruitment. I think the golden thread thinking applies to all organizations, which is if we have the job description and then we want to have a good hire in the role, then it seems blindingly obvious, but it's not how most people do, that you have a golden thread that takes you from the job description to then the measures that you will put in place to help that person understand whether they're performing in the right way in the role.
This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache and you don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Now, many of us in the talent acquisition and HR space have long known that the methods that are most commonly used to assess a candidate's suitability for a role are not sufficiently predictive, shall I say, of how they're going to go on to perform in that role. And we see it all the time at Instant Impact when we start working with a new client, and particularly where they haven't had professional in-house function before. We see untrained interviewers who are what I would call enthusiastic amateurs, prone to bias and hiring people in their image, even if they've got the best of intentions. And that sort of pervades the organization without the help of someone who really knows what they're doing. In good news, this is one area where a few really thoughtful interventions can make a huge difference. And in other good news, many businesses are being forced into action, because candidates are using AI to beat a system that they think is unfairly rigged against them. And they are now applying to hundreds of jobs a day with tools that are designed to customize CVs for particular job opportunities and do so at a huge scale at the click of a button. And companies are drowning in applications, and it's unrealistic to expect already time-stretched recruiters to manually screen hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes. Our guest today is Robert Newry. He is the Chief Explorer of Arctic Shores, a business that helps recruiters to uncover potential in candidates through task-based assessments. I'm happy to say it's part of the answer that we've all been looking for. Robert, welcome to the show.
Brilliant. Thank you, Felix. Delighted to be here.
So I wonder if we could just start with a pretty broad introduction to psychometrics. So can you just talk us through this? What are psychometrics and how do they work?
Yes, I mean, psychometrics have been around for a long time. The idea came out in the 1950s, really, the first use of psychometrics in the occupational or in the business world. So obviously, as humans, we've been studying the brain and what makes us do what we do for quite some time, but it's been very much driven by a sort of clinical review of the brain. And then in the 1950s, you saw a sort of jump into, well, actually, maybe what we're observing from a medical side could also be useful in how we hire. And you had two ladies, Myers and Briggs, who developed the Myers-Briggs test, which is very well known, but it came out of that clinical starting point. And the concept of it, in a nutshell, is that we can understand why people make decisions by asking them a series of questions from which we can determine a set of personality traits. And the key framework that pretty well most psychologists and psychometricians around the world agree with is called the 5-factor personality group, and so framework. And it basically boils it down to openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But the one that we probably all know most about, and we could have a discussion about too, is extroversion and introversion. That seems to be the personality trait that everybody understands and talks to regularly, but it is one of 5 that have been agreed as the core elements of human personality.
I think whenever we're talking about these sorts of things, it's really interesting because I have this deep-seated belief, which I know is flawed, that I am a unique snowflake and I operate unlike anyone. So whilst I have had a couple of very accurate psychometric profiles done of myself, where's the room for individuality within that kind of psychometric profile?
Yes. Well, there are 2 interesting things from what you raised there. One is, are we the best judges of our own personality? And in some areas we might be, in other areas we will have blind spots. If you ask a narcissist, are they a narcissist? They won't see that they are. So asking them questions about how they think they are perceived in the world, and therefore their personality type is going to be flawed. But also you raise another good point there, which is there are a lot of nuances around personality, and the challenge that a lot of people have had with personality assessments, and there's a difference, and we can come to that later, between an assessment and a test. But with a personality assessment is that we have a natural human desire to be in a tribe, in a group, in a community. And so what a lot of psychometric assessments did was group us into types. So you're one of 16 types. You could be a general, or you could be an author, and they come up with different types of references to kind of put you in that group. And yet, as you allude to, every human has a nuance to it, and so putting us into groups, however much we may like that, is more a human social need than it is a scientific way of understanding ourselves. And so the reason for telling that story is that psychometrics now are much more about the nuance, individual, what your personal areas of strengths might be, rather than trying to group you into some framework that sounds nice but actually doesn't stand up to science.
Oh, I was going to ask you one question. Okay. Now I feel like I need to ask you this other one, because you used a really key phrase, I think, in this, which is stands up to science.
Yes.
And I think, this isn't the psychometrics, or I suppose more advanced ways of testing candidates' personality and their strengths for a role has been an area where we've seen a lot of amazing successes.
Yes. And
a few cowboy practitioners or snake oil salesmen claiming that they can deliver the world, and then maybe that their way of testing doesn't stand up to science. And I wonder, being someone who's very involved in this space,
yes,
what do you think the lay of the land is now, in terms of companies that are, what proportion of psychometrics providers stand up to science, and what proportion don't, and how do you tell the difference between them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's one that's going to be increasingly asked. That with as you said in your introduction, with this sort of flood of applications that are coming through to recruiters now, we can't rely on the CV. So people are going to turn to what's the next tool that is most effective in helping us distinguish between candidates, and psychometrics is clearly another one. There is also potentially AI that will come into play in all of this as well. But from a psychometrics point of view, anybody can go out and create a personality test and market it. And if you put into Google personality assessments, you will get thousands of them. And it's very hard to know just by looking at them what's being properly thought through and has real substance and science behind it, and is what is a couple of people in a room who've just come up with a bunch of questions. And there are two ways to determine this. One is to look at a good psychometric provider will have a technical manual, and a technical manual will show all the evidence and the validation that they've undertaken, both prior to launching it and subsequently. So that's one thing I would always say to anybody who's thinking about using psychometrics and is talking to a provider: show us your technical manual. And then the other is certification. So you have the British Psychological Society, which is the only one in Europe that actually certifies a psychometric assessment for different types of use. And they have a set of standards as well. And so you can ask for evidence as to how that psychometric provider meets the benchmarks. And it's possible to go onto the British Psychological Society website and find out what those benchmarks are for things like, does your assessment measure what it says it measures? Mm-hmm. So for that, you'd have to compare it to something else and so show a correlation. Is it what you call reliable? So if you were to repeat this again after a period of time, would you get a similar set of results around that? And then the gold standard around all of this is, does your psychometric assessment, in addition to those two things, predict performance in the workplace? Because ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. It's all very well saying I measure personality, but I do it in a way that doesn't in any way help me decide if somebody's going to be good at a job. Then, okay, lovely idea, but that's not what we're trying to achieve as recruiters.
Fantastic. Now, I think that leads us really nicely onto this next question I have, which is, you've selected actually maybe before all of this, what would you say is the best way for a recruiter to implement psychometrics within a recruitment process? Because I've certainly seen businesses and individuals just say, you know what, I need a psychometric here, I'm going to get it. I'm looking for a salesperson, so I need someone that's really extroverted, and I need someone that follows the process, so they need to be diligent, whatever it is. And they just say, right, I need this, this, and this.
Yes.
Very little thought behind it, aside from gut feeling, which I would imagine has potential of enforcing bias rather than anything else. So how do you do it right?
Yes. Great question. And genuinely, that is, an important question too, because you have to think about it. A lot of people, first time, and usually sometimes the only time in a recruitment world they come across psychometrics is for executive hiring. Well, I remember once, challenging, I was asked this type of question and to go and present to HSBC Capital Markets a few years ago to the senior leadership team there. And I said, how many of you in this room, either during when you were recruited or at some point in your HSBC career, have done a psychometric assessment? And they all stuck up their hand. And then I said, and then how many of you use psychometrics to then hire your lowest level of employee? And they go, no, it's too expensive, it's too complicated. And so we, it's not scalable or commercial to do that. And so this is the interesting thing. You've got to start, if you want to do this right, you have to start with, what's the type of role I'm trying to hire for, and where will psychometrics add the best value? So in an executive one, you don't need it as a SIFT. You're going to look at their experience, you're going to do a lot of references, and you're going to source that person. And then prior to them coming to an interview, you might get them to do a psychometric so that you can understand a bit more about them. At the other end of the scale, early careers, you are getting thousands of applications. And so you need to introduce psychometric right at the top of the funnel, because I need to know about people's potential to learn, or their resilience, or their persistence. And so I need to know what are the factors that are there, as you put it at the beginning. And then that leads to the other point, which is, okay, well, how do I determine what those factors are? And the job description for me should be the starting point. Too often it is a hiring manager saying, yeah, the last person I hired was brilliant at music, or supported Manchester United, and I am a Manchester United fan. They must be good because, just by association of such a great team, then, that person must be good. And so you end up then with all these false triggers or criteria as to why somebody might hire them. So that for me, the starting point is look at the job description, and a well thought through job description that says, what are the factors that genuinely indicate if somebody is going to be good at this role? Some of it might be experience, but more likely than not, many of the others will be other things like their coachability or their resilience.
It's interesting because I feel like, you have to understand how someone's going to perform in what's going to make someone perform in a particular role. But are there also elements that make them perform in the company? So do you have to separate those two things out?
You do. There'll always be environmental factors around this. And the job description at the end of the day will be, what is the task that they're going to be doing on a daily basis? And so they have to have the core capabilities to do that role. And then there will, which I think is where the interview comes in, is how they're going to work with other people. What are their values? What are their motivations? You can bring in then the context of the work environment that they're going to be in. A contact center is very, very different from a retail store. But in both of them, you might want somebody who is immensely empathetic or had good emotional intelligence. But the context of the world that they're going to be living in and their work environment will be different. So there'll be other factors that you then want to explore when you bring them in to see them. And then,
so you've established that.
Yes.
How do we then layer over so you've got an interview which is checking for the context and the environment, and then the psychometric helps you better understand their ability to perform the task. Is that?
Exactly that. And those were the key words, actually, Felix, on this: perform the task. And this goes back to the core of, why I set up Arctic Shores. My fundamental belief is that the best way to learn about somebody is the way that they do something, rather than how they tell you that they might do something.
Yeah. Obvious when you say it out loud, isn't it?
Yes.
And that's where you ended up with task-based assessment. Essentially, that's what Arctic Shores does.
That's right. I'm not a psychologist by background, but I am somebody who has very strong interest in people, and having set up a couple of businesses in the past, I've always been interested in hiring. As as a founder of a business, one of the core factors of success is how you hire and who you hire. And so I was fascinated by that whole process of understanding people and trying. The thing for me is about how do you uncover somebody's capability? And I worried about just looking at a piece of paper and then trying to determine from that, is that person the right person for me to bring forward to interview or not? And all the things that are unsaid or unknown behind that piece of paper that actually I should be aware of, rather than just what I'm staring at and what I might be interpreting for what I'm staring at.
It's a It's a big leap to say that someone could just jot down a few bullet points on a piece of paper. It's going to tell you a lot about, also it's going to tell you everything that they've done in the workplace. I think it'd be really useful for our listeners, Robert, if you could just take us a step back and just talk us through Arctic Shores and the dent that you're looking, I guess the dent you're looking to make in the assessment process, in the recruitment process, and your, because you've got a really interesting lens on all of this, and really holistic. So I'd love it if you could take us through it.
Yeah, so it all started from this idea of, the way to understand about people is from the way that they do things. And I'd had a friend of mine who had called me, whose daughter had applied for 5 different graduate roles, all been doing the same intelligence test. And in days when I started Arctic Shores, almost every graduate employer just used an intelligence test. One of the market leaders at the time was a company called SHL. And that was the only way of screening whether somebody should be brought forward to the next stage or not. And if you underperformed in those types of assessments, that was it. Door closed. And so I wanted to find a way, was something that was a bit more engaging. I think that was the other thing, candidate experience. But the other thing was to really uncover potential. So to find things out about people that maybe they didn't even know. And the one of my favourite stories around this is that we started off with Deloitte, and for one of their apprenticeship school leaver programs, and one of the top people that we identified through our task-based assessment from that, who sailed through the process on that, 10 years on, is still there and is now in a senior position.
Fantastic.
And she came from a background where she left school at 17. Funny enough, had gone into recruitment because that's one of the few sectors where, if you didn't have A levels and you didn't have any prior experience, it was almost like becoming an estate agent. They welcomed anybody in there at the time who could pick up a phone. But she knew she could do more. And, but for trying to come up with a different type of psychometric assessment and uncovering that potential, people like her would not be given that opportunity. So that was really the driving force behind it. What the last piece on this that I think is interesting on this is that you have, the worlds of psychology, which is all about, what's your personality type. And then you have this whole world of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, which in the last 20 years, because of brain scans, we've really understood how the brain works. Still a lot to learn on that. But the two never spoke.
Really?
Yes. So the world of psychology was just personality types, and the only way we could possibly understand them is to ask you questions, because there's no other way. We can't tap into your brain. And then I was going, but hang on, and the advantage of being outside of the industry, coming in, going, well, when I looked at how you might measure somebody's personality, I looked into the world of cognitive neuroscience first, and discovered there's all this research that shows how the different parts of your brain drive bits of your personality. But never the two should meet until we came along and found a way of merging those two amazing areas of science, psychology and cognitive neuroscience.
And that's a fascinating story. I know you've been working at this for over a decade, yeah. So you're focused predominantly at early career and high volume.
Yes.
Why have you focused on that area?
Couple of reasons. One was, when you're trying to do something new, it's really hard to get people to experiment and adopt something new, particularly in the world of HR. If you're in the IT, and my previous business was in the IT sector, you go to the IT manager and go, have you got a budget for experimenting how you might improve cybersecurity, or how you might improve logins or some sort of element of improving the IT infrastructure. Absolutely. They have that in their remit. They have to. You go to somebody in HR and go, do you have a budget to experiment with something? No, I've barely got enough time just to get my day job done. And I certainly don't have budget for experimentation. The one exception to that was early careers. Early careers, because it ended up being a bit of a poster child for the organisation, had more marketing, more backing to be a bit more experimental because it was seen as competitive. How do you stand out against the other early careers?
And we're talking enterprise here.
We're talking enterprise, yeah. So
I'll definitely have some HR leaders in small, mid-sized companies being like, "Oh, that doesn't sound like our early careers at all."
No, true. And I think that's, like all of these things, you've got to try and find where's your little beachhead to get some experimentation. And then I think the other thing too is the problem that you want to solve. And the problem that Safe and I, when we set up the business, was to uncover potential, but we just didn't want to do it at the executive level and, maybe screen, a couple of thousand people. We had this idea, even at the beginning, we thought, gosh, could we screen 100,000 people? That would be amazing. We've now done 3 million over 10 years. Exactly. And it's fantastic to think that the 3 million people that have been through the Artificial system have all got an individual piece of feedback. And when I started the business with Safe, nobody in the early careers was given individualized feedback. We kind of take it for granted now that, of course, you want to give feedback. Well, back in 2014, that was not standard.
No, I remember it. I remember getting my Arctic Shores feedback report as well. Not that I applied to jobs with it, because I had already set up Instant Impact, but we were using you for a supplier, and I was doing for a client, I was doing my supplier due diligence. So no, it really was a first. So I think that's a really important shift that you guys have helped trailblaze. Yeah,
so of course. I mean, imagine, one of the things that I've obviously been around the block a lot, but aged 23, 24 when I started my first job, if I'd known a bit more about where my natural strengths were and where my natural weaknesses were, it could have saved me a lot of faffing around over 10 years of different bits of career journeys that I went on. If you get that right from the beginning, is going to be so useful to your career journey.
I mean, it's been one of the biggest shifts in my own role is becoming more cognizant of where my strengths. I've always known where my weaknesses are, manifold weaknesses that I have, but knowing where your strengths are and focusing time on finding activities that sort of along those same lines, where a strength in this area will make you naturally better at this task. It's huge. It just makes you enjoy your job more. It makes you better. It makes people respect you more. It's fantastic. So if you can get that feedback early in your career, wow, what an amazing.
Yeah. And you ask any senior executive who's gone through a psychometric assessment, so did you have found that valuable to learn a bit more? And they will say yes. And so why wouldn't we do that for everyone?
Absolutely. Now, I don't want to leave this interview without you telling us a little bit about the golden thread, which I know is a big, what is that, and how can companies apply that to their assessment, and I believe even the way that they sort of reward and promote people internally?
Yes. So this is the sort of interesting thing that I discovered, particularly in the last few years, about how we do recruitment. We put it into silos. So we will have, we've got a separate, this obviously applies a bit more to enterprises, but I think the golden thread thinking applies to all organisations, which is if we have the job description and then we want to have a good hire in the role, and that's one is the start and the other is the finish in there, then it seems blindingly obvious, but it's not how most people do, that you have a golden thread that takes you from the job description to then the measures that you will put in place to help that person understand whether they're performing in the right way in the role. And therefore, each of the steps as you go through from that job description to the job advert, to the application questions, to the first sift where you decide who you're going to bring in for interview and who not, when you bring them into interview, how you interview them, then how you onboard them, and then how you develop them. There should be a consistent thread from all those, across all those things. And so that you are layering each time as you go through the steps. But that's not what happens. What happens is somebody goes, oh, I've got job requisition. Okay, have you got job description? Yeah. And they kind of pull it out the drawer. Yes, exactly. The metaphorical folder that's been sat on their PC unused for multiple months, years. And then they go, there's the job description. Go and create a job advert from that. Oh yeah, no, we always used Indeed or LinkedIn for that. So off it goes. Then a bunch of CVs come in and go, okay, so I was talking to somebody recently about this and they say, okay, what are you looking for in this? Well, I got so many, Robert, that now if it hasn't been formatted in the right way.
Yeah.
Can you believe it, Felix? Exactly that. It hasn't been formatted in the right way. Or somebody was telling me, oh yes, they're clearly all the university's career sites now are telling people how to, what a good CV looks like. And so they're all coming in the same. And so I'm looking for something that's a bit different.
So damned if you do, damned if you don't. I remember that when I was leaving university, there were all of these stories. And when we were setting up Instant Impact, and we started as a graduate recruitment business, so we had all sorts of stories like this. But the one that stuck in my mind is there was one bank that they would print off all of the CVs, they'd throw them downstairs, and they'd take the CVs from every other step. And that was the first.
Extraordinary. When you think about it. And I'd had a similar one where, again, investment banking, and it was of those kind of, the 90s, early 2000s, around that, where they'd stack them up and he would take the top half off and put them in the bin and just go, unlucky, and then take the next half. I mean, that's, we're almost back at that again. So,
but it's just as arbitrary.
It's just as arbitrary. So you really need to think through, what are we measuring? Why are we measuring it? And how are we measuring it in the right way? And that when we, the thing that makes me sort of despair a bit is when somebody sits down for an interview and they go, tell me about your CV and what you've done. And you go, but hang on, you've just screened me on the CV and you know the answers to that. And I've spoken to your recruiter several times. So why are we sitting down and talking about that again? And that's where, the thread has been lost, the concept of the thread. So what I'm trying to do now is to say to people, get the process right and then use tech to make it repeatable, scalable, reliable. But get the process right, because otherwise you're just putting in technology there to repeat scale something that's flawed, and then we haven't moved the world forward.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think when we put in these new processes with our clients, we look for essentially what a balanced scorecard would look like. And if we've got all of these elements that we're looking to assess in a candidate, if they've ticked off one of the boxes and we're confident, for example, that they're commercial enough to deal with this sort of role, we won't ask them those questions in the future, because they've hit the bar, and
yes.
Let's move on.
Yes,
let's move on to the next thing.
What excites you about this organisation? Yes, and look at their values. And so when you actually take that overview, you suddenly realise what the potential of what you could achieve if you looked at it in the right way.
I'm a little aware of time, Robert. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. I'd love to just dig into. So for me, this feels like a no-brainer, right? To put in a structured, strengths-based, task-based assessment process. What are the key objections that you come across? So you've got someone in the business that thinks, this is cool, I want to run with this. What are the main things that you run into, sort of real blocks in an organization, and how do just maybe some of the ones that you've come across the most.
Yes. So there are two. One is because part of my focus and getting the message across about hiring for potential is scrap the CV, and you get hiring managers that go, "Oh, Robert, you saying to me that my experience, my 20 years of being, senior project engineer at this organisation is worthless now, and there's no way I could hire somebody unless they had some exposure and experience to what we're doing, and don't you understand the criticality and the health and safety and all these kind of things." I totally get all those things, and I'm not saying your experience doesn't count. What I'm saying is that in a world we live in at the moment where there's very, very limited skills for certain things, then there's no point everybody trying to hire for that limited pool of skills when demand outstrips supply.
Yeah.
And all of this. So we've got to take a different approach, which is, could we train somebody from a different organisation with transferable skills to learn some of the things, and could you teach them?
Mm-hmm.
And so and then that takes the to make change happen, you have to be controversial, because if somebody doesn't feel uncomfortable, you're not really challenging their preconceptions. And so you've got that balance of, yes, I'm deliberately trying to be challenging here, but I'm not trying to undermine the many great things that you might have done in your 20-year career. So let's just try and understand the purpose. That I want you to think that the CV is something that can be challenged, while at the same time thinking about, okay, how might we solve this problem where we don't have enough skills to fulfill the skilled jobs that are out there.
Well, not least, am I being too reductive here when I say, with the advent of artificial intelligence, with the pace that companies are having to relook at their operating model, bringing in new technology to do tasks that were previously done by skilled humans?
Yes.
Am I being too reductive when I say that skills have a shorter shelf life than they've ever had before?
Not at all. The McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group have all done studies on that, and the shelf life of a skill now is around 2.5 years, whereas in the past it would have been a lifetime. So and I think that 2.5 years may shrink further as AI becomes more widely used and trained, and people get trained in its use.
Wow, there's a thought point. You said you had two objections, so I want to make sure we do the other one as well.
Thank you. And then the other objection is, come on, Robert, how can possibly pressing buttons mean that you can learn about me?
Yeah.
And so it's trying to get people to understand that the reason why we do things is because of the chemical and electrical activity that's going on in your brain. Personality doesn't exist outside of the chemical, electrical activity that's going on in your brain. So are there things that I can present you with, and decisions that you then make in responding to it, that will be a good proxy for what's going on in your head? And then when people start to understand, yes, okay, whether I'm somebody that likes to spend a bit more time thinking about something before I intervene, or whether I'm somebody who likes to jump straight in, I can see that from our task-based assessment. And then that tells us, the type of person you are, and you can link it to personality. So that's the challenge in some of these things, is it's so new. The CV is like a comfort blanket.
Yeah.
So ripping that away and saying, use psychometrics. And they're going, no, I was very comfortable with the CV. And now you're introducing something that's completely new that I don't even understand. Or in a lot of cases, they've had a bad experience with it, saying, it was rubbish. Or, if you're told something about your personality that you don't like, then the obvious thing to do is to say, that's a rubbish way to understand it, because I don't like what it says, therefore it must be wrong, because that's a natural human reaction to how do I deal with adversity.
That's how I deal with adversity.
It is, depending on the personality type, it can be, a typical reaction to it. So that's the challenge around all of this, is you're taking something away that they feel very comfortable with and presenting something new that they may more than likely not be comfortable with or not be familiar with.
I can't resist asking this last question. I'm sorry, listeners, for going over the allotted half hour, but it's a beautiful day here in London. Not that you'd know it. We're locked away in our recording studio in London Bridge. Sun shining for the first time in a long time. And you and I are both in better moods than we've been in for a long time. We're talking about that in our very claustrophobic lift on the way up here.
Yes.
Do environmental factors, like how sunny it is, how warm it is, how hungry someone is, does that impact how they're going to perform on the Arctic Shores test?
So, simple answer to that is no, because as I was saying, that it's based on the way that your brain is wired and naturally prefers to do things. But if you think you're with a question traditional based assessment, 100% it would, because if you're feeling really good about yourself and you're then being asked a bunch of questions, you're going to answer it based on, because you're putting an overlay. Or if I ask you how you're feeling today, there'll be your core set of either happiness or tiredness, and then there'll be your overlay on top of that you then want to project out. If you're feeling better about yourself, more dopamine going around your brain, then you will respond in that way. And I think that's the thing about psychometrics, is how do we get to the real authentic picture of somebody that isn't being projected, and particularly in a high stakes situation like a recruitment, you are going to project something. And so we need to get, underneath all of that and find out what's the real capabilities of a person.
Well, that feels like a great time to end the podcast. Robert, thank you so much for coming in. I've learned a huge amount. I'm sure my audience has as well. So thank you for coming in.
Thanks, Felix. I really enjoyed it too.